Okay, and I'm sure we'll have more people coming and waking up. Thanks for being here. 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Australia, and for Bernardo it's 1 in the morning. So opposite ends of the world, but sharing this space together. Very excited. So just really just a couple of slides, and then it will be over to Bernardo. Just want to thank you all for attending this Exploring Metaphysics through the window of psychedelics. I feel very lucky to have Bernardo here today. I've been listening to his work for a long time now, and it's been really pivotal through my spiritual emergence, actually, in the late night hours of trying to figure out the universe, and just found his work really, really powerful. I'm not an expert. I'm very much just a curious explorer of consciousness, and really excited to have him here today. I ran a philosophy panel recently, and someone said, we were missing Bernardo. You should reach out to him. And I said, oh no, there's no way he's going to respond. And when you did, I just felt a deep gratitude for Australia and for you being here. And my husband personally wanted to pass on that you helped him to really make sense of Buddhism and Shaivism like no other author. So somehow that all really landed for him. So before we begin today, I just want to open the space and acknowledge the traditional owners in which we're all from, the incredible lands of Australia and from around the world, and just acknowledging the wisdom traditions that support consciousness, plant medicines, and the altars and jungle angels and TP wisdom holders who have used these medicines for thousands of years. May we really be custodians of them as they enter the mainstream landscape, particularly here in Australia. And just sending out a collective prayer, as I have many times, to Ukraine in this moment in history, as we are still very, very far from home when it comes to being one and looking after each other. I won't have time to go through all this, but just acknowledgement of all the incredible psychedelic organisations that are emerging in Australia. And if you ever want to reach out to discuss any, how to be involved and how to build this altar and this community in Australia, please do connect. And we're here at the Science of Life today, the pillars of courage, to explore the frontiers of medicine and self. That's why we've invited Bernardo. In integrity, to embody safety, truth, and a strong moral compass, to connect in community and to integrate together. And yes, just a little intro to Bernardo. He's obviously written many incredible books and many podcasts that you can search later that covers a vast terrain of fascinating material. But he's the executive director of the Essentia Foundation, specializes in metaphysical idealism and the notion of reality as being essentially mental. He has two PhDs, I believe, one in ontology of the philosophy of mind, and also has a background in AI and computer science. And we've got a range of questions designed, and then we can open up to the larger group. So I guess, Bernardo, would you mind just sharing your theory, your hypothesis, your worldview, and keeping in mind this group is really specialized in or focused and passionate about exploring consciousness through psychedelics.
Yeah. Sure. I defend what has become known as a form of objective idealism, or analytic idealism in my case. And the notion there is that there is an external world. There is a world out there, outside and beyond our individual minds. But that world in and of itself is also mental or experiential in nature. And the experiences or mental processes or mental states, that would be the more accurate way to refer to it, the mental states that constitute the external world present themselves to us upon observation as what we colloquially call the physical world. In other words, the contents of the screen of perception, the stuff we see, touch, hear, smell, feel. So under analytic idealism, the physical world is not the real world. It is an appearance thereof. It is how the world as it is in itself presents itself to us. It's what it looks like to us upon observation. And as such, what we call the physical world is an internal cognitive representation of our own. We each live in a different physical world because the physical world is private. But we do share a real world that really is out there in which we inhabit. And because we are all representing that same shared world in our respective physical worlds, our physical worlds are mutually consistent because they are all representations from a particular perspective of the same shared reality, a reality made of mental states, experiential states. Now, the same thing applies when it comes to our inner world. We all experience ourselves directly in a pre-theoretical way as mental beings. What we are is our conscious, experiential inner life. That's what we are. Our feelings, our emotions, our perceptions, our ideas, our fantasies, and so on. Now, when somebody else observes my mental inner life, what they see is my body, my brain, patterns of brain activity. In other words, physical stuff, matter. So when it comes to me or you, our mental inner lives, our inner mental states present themselves to observation from the outside, also as what we call matter. So under analytic idealism, matter, all matter, without exception, is always a representation, an appearance of mental states when those mental states are observed from an external perspective, from the outside. Now the question, and I'm almost through with this, the stuff is simple enough. The question that arises is, why are we separate from the world and separate from one another? Why can't I read your thoughts and presumably you can't read mine? Why don't I know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda if everything is just a universal set of mental states in a universal mind? We know from psychiatry that there is a phenomenon that can happen in mind called dissociation. And it can be as strong as to blind you to what is right in front of your eyes. This is something that was researched in Germany in 2015. There was a very interesting paper published, a woman with dissociative identity disorder, which had many dissociative alters. A couple of those alters claimed to be blind. So neuroscientists had this simple but brilliant idea of instrumenting her with an EEG cap to measure her patterns of brain activity. And lo and behold, when a blind alter, well, an alter that claimed to be blind was and had executive control of her body, brain activity in the visual cortex disappeared. So the woman really could not see what was right in front of her open eyes and well-working eyes. There was nothing physically wrong with her. And when a sighted alter or the host personality would retake executive control, normal brain activity would return to the visual cortex. So dissociation not only can form multiple disjoint centers of awareness, each with its own sense of identity, it can also make you blind to what is right in front of your eyes. So it's no wonder that I can't read your thoughts, because the hypothesis of analytic idealism is that we are, each of us, each living being is a dissociative alter of spatially unbound field of subjectivity that underlies all nature. Nature is that field of subjectivity. It is that one universal unitary mind, but it undergoes a process akin to dissociation and forms alters. And we are those alters. And that's why we are blind to what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda, and we can't read each other's thoughts. Now, research in the Netherlands has shown that if you put a person with dissociative identity disorder in a brain scanner, there are recognizable patterns of brain activity that correspond to the dissociation. Dissociation looks like something in the brain of a person with dissociative identity disorder. So does dissociation in the universal mind look like something? Well, of course it does. It looks like biology. It looks like life. So the inference of analytic idealism is that that's what life is. Life is what dissociative alters in the mind of nature look like when observed from across their respective dissociative boundaries. When observed from within the boundary, they are just mental inner life, our feelings, our fantasies, our thoughts. But from the outside, they look like biology, metabolism, organic entities that metabolize. And now, finally, the last question that people usually raise is, well, Bernardo, if we are alters of the mind of nature, how come we can see one another and shake hands? Because the alters of a patient with dissociative identity disorder cannot interact with one another. Well, that is not true. You have to look at the dream life of patients with dissociative identity disorder in order to make a fair comparison, because the universal mind has no outside world. It only has its endogenous mental state. So you have to compare that to the endogenous mental states of a person with DID. In other words, you have to compare that to the dream life of a patient with DID. And research done at Harvard many years ago already, 20 odd years ago, has shown that the different alters of a patient of DID do partake concurrently in the same dream, and they are co-conscious, conscious at the same time within their shared dream. And they do see one another, and they can shake hands, and they can even club one another over the head, which is one of the dreams reported. That happens in about 1/4 of patients with DID, which of course raises the question, and maybe it happens in all of them, but they just don't remember, as many of us don't remember our dreams. So this is it. This is analytic idealism in a nutshell. The world is mental. We are dissociative alters in the mind of nature. Biology is what the dissociation looks like. Death is the end of the dissociation and the reintegration of our inner lives into this unitary field of subjectivity that underlies reality.
Wow. I've worked with DID for the last 15 years, and when I stumbled across your work, it really not only got me more curious about my clinical practice, but being an alter myself in the universal mind, and it's just such an incredible way of exploring the nature of reality. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more around, as we know with psychedelics, the boundaries dissolve, the default mode network shuts down, different centers of the brain, light up, but that sense of self dissolves, and many people experience, myth, legend, archetype, shape shifting. What is going on there in relation to your theory? Is there anything you'd like to add?
So under analytic idealism, the body is what the dissociation looks like, the entire body and the active body, not a dead body. A dead body is very distinct from a metabolizing body. There is something very obvious missing when somebody is no longer alive. The dead body is a kind of footprint left behind of something that nature was doing but is no longer doing. And you can recognize that by looking at metabolism. Is it still running or not? So patterns of brain activity are part of what the dissociation look like. Now, a dissociation entails two things: the dissociative content, the inner life of the alter, but also the mental process that corresponds to the dissociative boundary itself. It stands to reason that at least some of what we refer to as brain activity corresponds to the dissociative boundary. It is what the dissociative boundary looks like. When psychedelics reduce brain activity, impair normal brain function, it also stands to reason that part of that reduction is an impairment of the dissociative boundary. We may have even nested hierarchical dissociative boundaries within ourselves, because the ego is dissociated from the parts of your mental inner life that correspond to your liver, your kidney, even sometimes muscle control when you're riding your bike or when you're breathing. We are a collection of more or less internally dissociated mental complexes. Now, the boundary of the alter encompasses all that, of course. Now, when psychedelics reduce brain activity, they may be impairing not only the boundary of the alter itself, but internal dissociative boundaries within the alter that open the gates to childhood memories, traumas. But the psychedelics may also be reducing the overall dissociative boundary that separates us from the world, which stands to reason may allow for traffic of mental contents that normally would be kept away from our mental inner life, normally would be accessible only through perception, through representation. They may become directly accessible. We may start, putting our toes in the ocean of mentation that surrounds us and picking that up from a first-person perspective. That's what I think is going on under psychedelics. It's an impairment of one or more dissociative boundaries, and therefore a reduction of the dissociation.
Do you have any comments on why metacognition might be an important skill to have for psychedelic journeyers if their boundaries, alters boundaries are blurring and people are entering those spaces? Is there anything you can speak to metacognition as a skill?
Well, it's certainly a critical skill for life, our ability to think about our own thoughts, to evaluate our own inner life, to be critical of ourselves, to ask questions like, am I doing the right thing? Is this feeling appropriate? These are all metacognitive skills. So metacognition, which is the key characteristic of human beings, we metacognize a lot more than the next in line, which could be, I don't know, cetaceans, pachyderms, other higher primates. But my own experience with psychedelics is that they tend to dissipate metacognition. If you insist on explicitly evaluating the contents of your own mind, you may delay a full embracement of the trip, so to say. If you insist on analyzing it too much, you don't really break through. You still have a trip. And if you're not experienced, you come back and you think, oh, wow, I have an amazing trip. Far out, man. But you haven't. A true breakthrough entails ego dissolution and a significant reduction of metacognition. Where you can truly apply metacognition is immediately upon returning, even when you're not fully back yet, but you can already start applying metacognition to your memory of the experience, reflecting on the experience on the mirror of memory before it dissipates, and then make notes. Not only diary notes relating what happened, but also analysis notes, because you cannot analyze something that is no longer fresh. That's where that skill comes in, and it's critical to the integration of the psychedelic trip, because a psychedelic trip is not a discerning event. There is a lot of nonsense and bullshit in a psychedelic trip, but immersed in all that crap, there are jewels. There are things that can change your life, that can far improve you as a human being towards yourself and towards others. So that ability to reflect on the trip, on the mirror of memory afterwards, during the integration process, I think is essential if psychedelics are to be used as a tool for becoming more adult, for maturing and becoming a better person. Otherwise, it's just, I don't know, just like going to a kermesse or to a park and having fun. That's not how I ever used psychedelics. So.
Yeah, really, really well said. We in my programs we really speak to metacognition, in the preparation phase, and then in the dose or in the altered space, really embracing and stepping into the symbolic realm and being able to, explore myth and archetype and the blueprints, and then later metacognition coming back online. I guess there's a lot of people in this space who are really passionate about Jung, and psychedelics and the dream space. Is there anything that you would like to add in relation to your own work on Jung and what it's done for you in this space, and anything that our viewers might benefit from?
I can speak for a day on Jung. What more precisely would you like me to speak to regarding Jung?
Yeah, anything that would benefit people who are exploring consciousness through the lens of psychedelics, and any insights that you've got from Jung's work in that space.
There are endless insights from Jung, one of the most productive minds of the 20th century, if not the most profound and productive mind. Jung has shown us that there is a lot more to our own personal minds than we could imagine if we don't do some kind of depth work. And moreover, the boundaries between our personal mind and a broader mind aren't sharp. Mind doesn't end at the boundary of our own mind. Mind continues on to something that is collective, to something that is human, as opposed to Bernardo's or Alani's or David's or Kylie's. And then it goes beyond the human. It becomes an earth field. And there are those who would say, and then it goes beyond that. And then it starts touching on the psychoid, what Jung called the psychoid, which is this transition from what we call mind and what we call matter, which for Jung was a transition merely of degree, not a fundamental transition of kind. For Jung, matter is psychoid. Matter is an appearance. It's how the collective so-called unconscious presents itself to us through perception. And it can present itself to us through mythological fantasies when engaged through introspection as opposed to perception. So for Jung, Jung was essentially an idealist, and I made the case for it in a book. If you think I don't know what I'm talking about, you have every right to think that, since I just made that statement without further substantiation here. But I did write a book about it in which I substantiated carefully. And Jung insists on this throughout his corpus, in moments when he says, for instance, God is within, but it's not for that reason that God is any less important or any smaller, because the within is as infinite as the without. They touch each other. They may be the two facets of one and the same thing. The world within is as infinite as the cosmos. So if God is within, that's in no way a limitation that we are placing on the idea of God or the self with capital S. So Jung has brought back into the Western discourse and the Western mind and the Western life the importance of introspection. And he has brought down this culture-bound limitations that we perceive introspection to have. It's like, if you introspect, you're always limited by this little thing here, while the world out there is enormous. And what Jung shows us is that if you introspect deep enough, you are in the world out there. And you are deeper in the world out there than you could ever be through perception. So yeah, Jung is a fundamental figure in the 20th century. He has held the light through the darkness of behaviorism, logical positivism, all that nonsense that began early in the 20th century, primed by the late 19th century. And he held that light alive until consciousness returned to scientific discourse in the 70s with a seminal paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? So Jung is a fundamental link. Without him, we would have gotten lost in darkness early in the 20th century.
Are you okay to speak to what it's like to be a bat? Because there's some people who might not be familiar with that article and your take on that discussion.
What is it like to be a bat? Yeah. Mainstream psychology throughout the first half of the 20th century and well into the 60s ignored experience. It ignored the qualitative aspect of mind. It only talked about function and behavior, as if our minds were unconscious computers and we were unconscious robots that manifested behavior. Actually, that's the essence of behaviorism, or Skinner's black box. Skinner was a psychologist, was the champion of behaviorism. And the idea was ignore what is within us. Just look at the outside as if we were black boxes. And you will know everything there is to know about the mind if you look at behavior. I mean, could there be a more insane idea produced by an educated human being than that? That's one of the most tragic notions to have ever been taken seriously in any culture on this planet. So mind was abstracted away, it was ignored, and the idea for it, in a leap of circular reasoning, was that well, we know that mind is epiphenomenal anyway. It's something that matter generates. Therefore, it has no causal powers. It doesn't cause anything. It is only caused by matter. Only matter causes things. Only matter has effects. And mind is a sort of a glow around the workings of matter that is entirely inconsequential and unimportant because it has no causal effectiveness. Therefore, we don't need to study the mind. And therefore, we never question the materialist assumption that the mind is just epiphenomenal because we never study it. So that was the darkness of the 20th century, in which we got rid of the mind because it was the one thing that could completely destroy and contradict our favorite worldview, materialism, which has become mainstream around mid-19th century after the July Revolution of 1830. When the Enlightenment lost its ethos of edification and became oriented towards practical applications and making money, and the bourgeoisie replaced the clergy as, you know, the leading thinkers of our culture. And it was only 1974 when Thomas Nagel published this paper called What is it like to be a bat, that the discussion about true mind experience qualities returned, because Nagel asked, you know, even if we know everything about how the brain of a bat works, how the bat behaves, even if you dissect every single neuron and we know down to the molecular level the configurations and movements and charges of every elementary subatomic particle in the nervous system of a bat, even if we write equations for everything that predict where each molecule will be and will be doing at any point in time, we will still not know what it is like to be a bat. And the key characteristic, the key feature, the distinguishing feature of mind is not function, it's not behavior, it's not configuration. It is, what is it like to be it? What are the experiential qualities entailed in being a mind? What is it like to be a bat? Can we know what is it like to be a bat if we know everything there is to know mathematically and physically about the disposition of the molecules in a bat's nervous system? Of course not. Suppose you were born colorblind. You're Jane, the colorblind scientist, and you're a neuroscientist, and you study color perception. And you know everything there is to know about how the brain and the retina process stimuli that we call colors. You know everything there is to know about how the brain engenders what we call color. But you're colorblind. Do you know what red is? Does Jane know what red is? Jane knows what the frequency of the frequency in the electromagnetic spectrum that corresponds to red. Jane knows how electromagnetic frequencies impinge on the retina and excite the cones. Jane knows how those cone excitations are translated into electrochemical impulses through the optical nerve. Jane knows how those impulses arrive in the visual cortex and how the visual cortex then processes those impulses through multiple layers, through neuronal firings. But Jane doesn't know what it is like to see red. There is something about quality, about the experience of seeing red, the experience of being afraid, the experience of falling in love, the experience of having a bellyache that no scientific equation will ever be able to convey. And this obvious, obvious idea that this is what mind is about somehow vanished from the Western culture and Western discourse from mid-19th century all the way into 1974. Over 100 years, we have lost sight of the most obvious, the one given natural reality, which is experience. Experience is the only pre-theoretical given. Anything that is not experience is a product of theory, of conceptualization, of abstraction. We lost sight of the one thing that is given for over 100 years, and it returned only with Thomas Nagel. And then after him, in the early 80s, the discourse was called the explanatory gap, which is the explanatory gap we have between the physical equations that describe the movement of molecules in the nervous system and what it is like to see red, or what it is like to be a bat. In the 90s, David Chalmers relabeled it. He called it the hard problem of consciousness, which is how we go from structure and function to the qualities of experience. And it's impossible to do that under materialist premises. These two domains are incommensurable. And to this day, it's still called the hard problem of consciousness. So that this obvious, I even feel embarrassed to call it an insight. This obvious observation has only returned to the Western discourse with Thomas Nagel's seminal 1974 paper, What is it like to be a bat? Finally, someone asked the most obvious question. What is it like to be a mind?
Thank you for explaining that. You put that so eloquently. On a practical note, what do you think the impact has been on the mental health system or on psychology when experience was removed in that sense?
Oh, it was disastrous because there was no alternative but to treat human beings as machines. And so we ignored one of the three avenues to therapy, and arguably the most important one. There are three avenues to therapy. One is medicine. A drug is injected into your system, either because you swallowed it or it was literally injected through a hypodermic needle. The second one is surgery. Something is manipulated in your anatomy physically. And of course, the third one is psychology. It is talk therapy. It's reaching the body through the mind. Under analytic idealism, the body is what the whole mind looks like. The body is mind. What we call the biology is just the appearance, how the mind presents itself to external observation from across a dissociative boundary, how it appears on the screen of perception, our internal dashboard of dials that convey information about the world. So through therapy, if one can allow therapy to sink beyond the boundaries of the ego, because the ego is here. It's a cloud of conceptual thinking up here, set of narratives. So whatever remains in the ego doesn't sink into the body. It only translates into different patterns of brain activity. To sink into the body, you have to go beyond that internal dissociative boundary. You have to allow emotional charge to sink into the rest of your mind. If that is achieved, you achieve physical effects, physiological effects, and we call it the placebo effect today, which is just a sort of a placeholder. We don't understand what it is. We know it's there. It's getting stronger. It's getting more difficult for companies to approve new drugs, because to get approval, they need to prove that the new drug is sufficiently better than placebo, but placebo is getting better. So it's getting very tough to approve new drugs now. And although placebo is a recognized effect in medicine, from a materialist perspective, it's an embarrassing thing. It's something that shouldn't be there, but it is. So it's vexing. And what it's telling us is that there is a way to reach physiology through the mind, through psychology, through talk therapy, through an experiential approach, not only drugs and surgery. Now, I do not poo-poo drugs and surgery. I take drugs myself. I would be dead if there were no drugs and surgery. So I take them very seriously, but I find it an obscene waste. That's the third avenue, which has the least potential for side effect and perhaps the greatest potential for true cures, is neglected, and it's only now returning.
Well said. And we're seeing a huge shift in Australia with MDMA and psilocybin now legally prescribable by psychiatrists, and we're going to see that shift from the biomedical model to experience, to psychiatrists signing off on people dissolving their egos, dropping into body, expanding into consciousness, and somehow putting that in a government regulated system. So it's, very interesting times here in Australia. This question just came to me, and I'm not sure how you'll take it, but obviously when people experience psychedelic phenomena, they go beyond the personal self, go into the transpersonal, and often experience healing in non-linear time. Being healed in the future, in ancestors' lineage, going backwards. Do you have any comments on time that you would like to share?
On time. In physics, time is the number one mystery right now. In the beginning of the Enlightenment, when the Western science began, late in the Renaissance, early in the Enlightenment, time and space were considered sort of fundamental scaffolding of the world out there. It's the dimensions where you put things, or the dimension where things can exist with extension, where things can have meters and seconds, duration and size. It was considered something a priori, and Newton took space-time to be a priori dimensions of extension, a scaffolding of the world that pre-exists everything. Relatively shortly after that, already a while ago, we figured out that that's not quite how things work. Kant was, in the West, the first to propose that space and time are parameters of cognition. They only exist in our personal minds. They are not out there. They are the way our personal minds organize information about the world, so we are not overwhelmed with input. It's like, if you have a big folder with lots of pages and they are piling up on top of one another, you don't know what to do with it. So what you do is you take each page and you spread them on the floor, so you have an overview. Well, there you go. That's time and space. That the spreading the pages on the floor, so you're not overwhelmed and you have an overview. Schopenhauer agreed with Kant a few decades after Kant, 3 or 4 decades after Kant. And since then, that idea has remained in Western discourse, mostly not being taken seriously since early 20th century, but now being taken seriously again, big time in the grand unification approaches to physics. Physics, we haven't unified gravity or general relativity with quantum field theory, and we know both are true, but they are contradictory. So we have to find a way to unify them. And almost invariably now with loop quantum gravity, the other quantum gravity, the other approaches to quantum gravity, time and space are epiphenomenal. They are not there from the beginning. Reality as it is in itself is beyond time and beyond space, or behind time and behind space. Time and space being products of quantum level processes, and reality as it is in itself is something that you can model mathematically, but you cannot visualize, because visualization already presupposes spatial-temporal extension. Even if it is only in your own mind, in your daydreaming and you're fantasizing, you still extend things and you spread them across dimensions of time and space, mental time and space. So I think one of the key challenges for the 21st century, and probably one of the 3 most amazing transitions that we are going to make in the 21st century, most likely in the first half of the 21st century, one of the 3 is a new understanding of time, which will inevitably bring with it a new understanding of life and death, because life and death are processes unfolding in time.
Yeah, I support many people who often find it very difficult to integrate, feeling, mortality and impermanence, yet opening up into, infinity and traveling through time, and just how to navigate those paradoxes together. So yeah, beautiful. Thanks for explaining all that. I could literally listen to you for hours and hours. I'm wondering if we want to drop in with any questions at the moment while I ponder some more. Patrick, now, fellow Jungian, now's your time if you've got any any questions. Good to see you, mate. You're on mute. There we go.
Yeah, I just put the video on. I've been having breakfast. Muted. Yeah, I was curious about the concept of good and evil. It's one of the things I've always struggled with Jung over the last 40 years. I've been reading him as an analyst, or developing an analyst, and now an analyst. And he seems to think that the infinite imagination, God, or whatever we want to call it, has the same struggle as we do with good and evil. And I'm just wondering how you guys think about that.
I tend to be a Jungian through and through. I do agree with Jung. I think the modern tendency we have in Neo-Advaita, the New Age, some approaches to spirituality, to say that at the bottom level of reality, it's all good, it's all goodness, it's all love. I feel skeptical about that. There certainly is universal love. People experience it, it's there. But I do not see any compelling reason to think that its opposite wouldn't be there too. I see good and evil as polarities in a spectrum. That's how Jung saw them as well. And there is a degree of wishful thinking in modern Western spirituality in trying to get rid of the evil. Even in the East, this is not done. In the East, what they talk about is transcending good and evil. So you transcend that polarization and you get more to the thing in itself, which is morally neutral. The smarter Neo-Advaita people, they will explain it this way. at the foundational level, at its bottom level, reality is morally neutral. It's not good, not evil. It has the same potential for both, for being good and for being evil. But we register it as fantastic because of the baggage we lose in the process of getting there. You have to lose your worries. You have to lose your anxieties. You have to drop a lot of stuff on the way to a first person experience of the bottom level of reality. So relatively speaking, given where we come from, I mean, we are in hell, but there is no realm that is more hellish than this, I think. It doesn't get any more claustrophobic, limited, and prone to suffering than to be a metacognitive animal that knows it will die in a world like ours. So dropping that baggage feels to us, relatively speaking, as a fantastic improvement in our condition. But the more level-headed meditators, I think, if they can bring in metacognition with them, with psychedelics, it's difficult. With meditation, it's probably more doable. If you can bring your metacognition with you while you're there, you will probably be able to evaluate, you know, the mental neighborhood there and grok that it is pretty morally neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It's as prone to love as it is to fear. And love and fear, good and bad, they are the polarities that emerge when that fundamental layer sort of expresses itself and starts unfolding. When it's like a lake at rest that begins to ripple. Ripples have tops and bottoms, you know, they go up and down. So these polarities emerge when the lake starts to ripple. But when it's not rippling, when it's calm, it's perfectly neutral. It's right on the middle ground. It's not high, it's not low, it's right level. It's leveled. So that would be my position. So with Jung, I would, if I were a teacher of some sort, which I'm not, I'm a philosopher, but if I thought of myself more highly than I do, and I felt that I could tell people something useful for them for how to live their lives, I would say, don't ignore evil. Don't make the mistake of thinking that evil is not really real, of going down that dangerous theological road that Western theologians embraced a couple of centuries ago. And even today, I think it's still dogma in the Catholic Church. Or maybe not. Depends on the theologian. That evil is simply an absence of good and not a power in and of itself. I would warn against getting to this conclusion because it's an extraordinarily dangerous conclusion. To deny the power of evil is to expose oneself, is to lay oneself bare to evil. Not only oneself personally, but one's culture, one's civilization, one's society. Just, I mean, I am in Europe. You guys are safe in the global south. I live next to the largest military landing strip in Western Europe. If there is a nuclear exchange, I won't even know. I won't even know it happened. No, I will be sublimated and vaporized before I can even cognize in 300 milliseconds what's going on. And there is a very evil person loose in my continent right now, wreaking havoc. A mafia head who happens to be the head of a very diseased, ill state. That is evil. And it is a force. It's not the absence of something. It is an active force. It latches in, to a kind of frequency in the behavior of mind that is conducive to evil doing. it has a power of its own. It has a seduction of its own. And I think mature societies would do well to get rid of the stigma that it's a bad thing to understand evil. No, I think it's incredibly important to understand evil, but we think it's shameful to understand evil, to understand how a criminal mind works. We should understand this. We should empathize with it, not sympathize, but empathize. We should be able to feel that smell, to ride that boat a little bit under supervision, to understand what is the attraction, what is the payoff of going down that road. And I make this a personal exercise for myself, and I fail in some specific case of evil that they seem to be so beyond me. I cannot fathom them. Usually it has to do with evil towards children. I just cannot fathom that. But I have managed to fathom anger, rage, and I'm beginning to fathom true evil. True evil is not sadism. Sadism is personal. Sadism is close. It's eye to eye. It's moist. It has humidity in the air, breath in the air, skin contact. That's sadism. Sadism is not the deepest evil. Sadism is always limited because it's personal. It's never large scale. You know, how many people can you torture and kill in a lifetime? Yeah, hundreds. And that's tremendous evil, but it's not the evil that's loose in the European continent right now. That's the statistical evil, and that evil arises from abstraction. It's when an abstract goal takes precedence over the reality of human experience. And empathizing with that evil is tremendously important, because only by understanding it can we prevent it. Only by understanding it can we make sure that there is no next Putin. We have had enough Putins and Stalins and Hitlers. But we systematically fail to understand evil because we think it's shameful to understand evil. So just to conclude this long-winded answer, I think evil is a true force. It's not just the absence of something. And it's critical for us to understand it.
Did you want to respond at all, Patrick? Or?
Yeah. Well, I was asking also about the Godhead itself. Is there a universal? Does the infinite imagination struggle with the same things that we're struggling with good and evil? Or, one of the influences that I'm getting interested or have been interested in for some years now is the near-death experience literature, which seems to suggest that the infinite imagination doesn't have any evil, that it is all good, that it is all loving. God is love, to quote one of the Gospels. John, I think it is.
A small percentage of near-death experiences are terrible, and they do entail evil. Because near-death experiences are near-death experiences, the person dies but comes back. Nobody who comes back has been far into that process, because you've returned and you were still experiencing it with some degree of individuality. So because of that, I think a lot of what one experiences in a near-death experience is one's own baggage, is what one brings with oneself. And if that's true, that's great news. Most people bring something loving and good with themselves. Other people have skeletons in the cupboard. I'm not saying that they are evil, but they carry deeply ingrained fears, traumas, something that may even be transpersonal, that they get in touch to when they begin that dissolution of the dissociative boundary. As for the Godhead, I don't make a distinction between nature and God. Physical nature, the nature that we perceive, is a cognitive representation of the activity in God's mind. And if you look at physical nature, you know, a storm can irrigate the farmer's field, or it can flood the town and kill a lot of people in terrible ways. A supernova, when a star goes supernova, whoever is anywhere in the neighborhood is fried, is toast. Even if they are good aliens, they are fried. Goodbye. No, it's been a good journey, but now you're gonna die a horrible death. So evil can be done through ignorance, through the lack of self-awareness and metacognition. Most evil is done that way. The evil of a Putin is the evil of abstraction, is the statistical evil, the worst kind of evil. And you can only put historical and geopolitical abstractions ahead of the gritty first-person experience of people if you are severely alienated from the gritty first-person experience of people. If you have a tremendous lack of empathy, if you cannot relate to other human beings as your equals, if you cannot take their own perspective in your imagination. So the evil inherent in the Godhead is probably the evil of that is allowed to exist through a lack of metacognitive insight. Nature doesn't seem to be metacognitive. Just look at the evolution of life on planet Earth. 4 billion years of blood in which life can only survive by killing and eating other life, with a couple of honorable exceptions, like mushrooms, who only eat on dead stuff. And plants who feed on minerals and starlight. But from that point, that very low point, unevolved point, all the way to us, it's 4 billion years of suffering and blood. Years ago, I saw this program on the Discovery Channel, one of these nature programs. A pride of lions managed to isolate an adult elephant from the rest of the group. And they brought down this adult elephant, and they started feeding on this elephant from behind, from the back of its legs up. And they were eating this elephant for 6 hours before the elephant passed out. So for 6 hours, the elephant was conscious, eyes open, the trunk was moving. Because of blood loss, it was too weak to try to stand up, and the lions were eating. That's nature. That's nature for you. That's the work of God. If God had more metacognitive insight, and Jung writes about it in Answer to Job, and he talks about this transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament and the prefiguration of Christ that Job is. Job is the metacognitive mirror that's placed in front of the eyes of God. So God can begin to understand the consequences of what it is doing. And of course, in the New Testament, instead of punishing somebody else, like God did with Job, God incarnates and punishes himself. That's the leap of first-person metacognitive insight, and the leap to empathy that is symbolically encoded in the New Testament. Instead of torturing Job for no reason, now God incarnates and goes up the cross and dies a horrible death. Finally, God begins to understand, right? But that understanding doesn't seem to have gone very deep, because here we are killing one another. So yes, I think the mind of God, insofar as it lacks metacognition, which it certainly does, because it took 4 billion years of evolution on planet Earth for a living creature to begin to show metacognition. The mosquitoes don't have it. Cats don't seem to have it. Because of that lack, and insofar as that lack is there, I think evil is a latent potential in the mind of God, in the Godhead, yes, just as latent as love. God doesn't know what it's doing, and that's the message of the book of Job, right? When God goes on that rant in the book of Job, I am the power behind the storms. What he's saying is, I am powerful, but I have no clue what I'm doing. And Job is the first one to try to tell God through a metacognitive perspective that there are consequences to what it's doing. You know, an elephant can remain alive for 6 hours while being eaten. Is that how you want to set things up? Really? Now, if you knew better, would you have done that? Because who is experiencing the pain of the elephant? It's God. God is doing this to itself. And of course, it wouldn't do that if it knew better. Hopefully, it will know better over the eons. But yes, I think evil, the capacity to inflict tremendous suffering, is clearly as latent to the mind of God, as latent to nature as the capacity to love. Anyone who denies this has to explain to me how that elephant was allowed to die that death.
That was incredible, Bernardo. I was raised a fundamental Christian with minimal metacognition, and some of the things you said there just like really hit home to my whole, indoctrination and nature of reality. So thank you for speaking to that. And just wanted to add, I've been a sexual abuse therapist my whole professional life. My husband's a sexual abuse detective, and we come in contact with evil, most days. And it's nearly broken me twice. It's nearly completely taken me under. And it wasn't until ayahuasca that I was able to make contact with evil in a way that was cathartic and healing and releasing. So I really watch out for my clients who are working in the psychedelic space, who are chasing the light all the time, because it's just, it's just not reality. We've got all those energies, and I think to be grounded in it, you do need to have some contact, some boundary with that darkness to know it and see it, or you can be very harmed or naive or spiritual bypassing. So yes,
yeah, it's critical to be in sufficient contact with that energy to understand it. Not enough contact that you get overwhelmed by it, and then that's the tricky trade-off, but enough that you understand it so you can deal with it when it comes up.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Kylie, did you want to speak?
Thanks, Lani. Thanks, Bernardo. As an artist, I spent a lot of time thinking about the things that you've discussed today, especially about elephants in the room, those sorts of things. Do you see art as important to understanding and working through all of the catastrophe we have right now?
I think art is important in two ways. As a form of expression, even if nobody's going to see your art, it doesn't matter. It's important that what is emerging be expressed. And Jung was the champion of this notion. Giving form to what emerges from what Jung called the unconscious. What he meant was the non-meta-conscious, the non-metacognitive, but still experiential. It's very clear that that's what he meant, but I'll stick to his words. What emerges from the unconscious, it's very important that we give form to it, because it's a way to tape it to the ego, to not let it go away, to not let it slip away. The Witoto, a tribe in South America, they had this metaphor. I said tape it. The Witoto talk about binding a dream with a little bit of cord, to just not let it evanesce away, not let it slip away, because this stuff is so evanescent, and you can only build a relationship with it if it sticks around a little bit. And art as a form of self-expression is critical to make it stick around. And for others, it's a portal that they don't see themselves. So through the expression of someone else, they may get a hint of something. This happened for me with Kandinsky, which most of my friends look at a Kandinsky and they say, just scribble some nonsense geometrical, colorful stuff that you can do in the kindergarten. I don't think so. but I can't explain why. For me, Kandinsky unlocked some strange door that to this day I can't give words to, which is how it's supposed to be. The things that you can give words to, you don't need art for that. You need art for the things that you can't give words to, for things that stick around in your mind in form, but not in words and concepts. Kandinsky did that for me. So yes, I think artistic expression is important. It's not going to save the world. So, but it doesn't need to be able to save the world to be important.
Thank you. It's funny that you said Kandinsky, actually, because he understood the essence of spirit in art. I think that's really where that's at. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm curious what will save the world if it's not art.
That's a good question, isn't it? I think maturity will save the world, but we are a long way off.
Mm-hmm. And Axel, would you like to speak to your question?
Yeah, I can. Good morning. So thanks for the talk. It's always wonderful to listen to you, Bernardo. I was wondering whether you, and I probably have heard you say it, or maybe Federico Fagin, the idea about purpose of life, and whether behind the emergence of the altars is also that nature or mind at large or the universe essentially wants to know itself. And I think that goes towards what you said earlier, that God doesn't have a clue what he's doing or it's doing. So is that your view? And could you elaborate on that a little bit? And what does that mean for us in our daily lives as altars?
I don't think there is a premeditated purpose to this existence. It's not like God sat and thought, what am I going to do? I'm going to do this, and so these little guys can go and try to achieve this or that. I don't think that's how it works. I think the mind of nature in and of itself, except for what we contribute to it, is instinctive. It is pure in the sense that it doesn't have an agenda. It's getting to know itself. It's feeling its way around the darkness, trying to optimize some function related to feeling bad or feeling good, trying to feel better rather than to feel bad. And in its semi-blind attempts, that's the word Schopenhauer used. You have a German accent, so you probably will relate to Schopenhauer more. Schopenhauer talked about the blind will, which is something that wills. In other words, there is impetus, but it's blind. In other words, there is no metacognitive awareness. So a blind impetus, think of it as a newborn who is hungry. The newborn is not telling itself, oh, I need food. No, it just doesn't like the state of being hungry, so it does something, just does something. It screams, it waves its hands, it cries. And God does something. And in this doing, we have had the evolution of life on planet Earth. It seems to be going somewhere. It seems to be instinctively, spontaneously pushing towards something. And since we are at the peak of that evolutionary ladder, in the sense that we control the planet, nobody else does. No other species controls the planet. We do, which may be it may be the bad news, since we unplugged from the web of instinct that keeps everything balanced. Metacognition unplugged us, but allowed us to gain control of that from which we unplugged. That's the greatest gamble in the history of nature on planet Earth. But it seems to be pushing towards us. And what characterizes us above all other creatures? The metacognitive ability to think symbolically, to think conceptually, to take metacognitive notice of what's going on, to be able to say, this is happening. And I know that this is happening. And I know that this is happening. Jung talked about it in his autobiography, Memory, Dreams, Reflections, when he's talking about his trips to Africa. And then there is part of his narrative in which before dawn, he leaves his camp. I mean, he's traveling with 3 other companions, two men and a woman. And then he has some local, carriers and taking their luggage with them, and they are camping. So before dawn, he leaves the camp and he goes to an open field to watch the sunrise. And as the sun pops out, it illuminates, the grazing animals on the fields. And then he has this insight that the fact that he is metacognitively apprehending nature is a second act of creation. Without his observing nature at a metacognitive level, all that would still be happening, but in a kind of darkness. It would be happening, but it wouldn't know that it's doing it. It wouldn't know that it's happening. It would be happening instinctively, spontaneously. And by him taking metacognitive notice of that, there is a second act of creation that brings the original creation to a second level, to a metacognitive level. And he considers it not a mere improvement, but a fundamental change. And he considers this to be the purpose of human existence, to take metacognitive notice of creation. We are the eyes through which God looks upon his creation and tells himself, oh, this is happening. I have done this. Jung talks about it also, and more technically and directly in answer to Job. There is one paragraph, one paragraph that it's worth its size in gold, platinum, titanium, every metal in the world, diamonds, opals. You guys from Australia, opals are big with you. So opals, one paragraph, the most fundamental paragraph in all the 20 volumes of the collected works, in which he says, this is the power of man over God. This is what man, I'm speaking sexist language here because that's how Jung wrote it. I don't mean to, I wouldn't say it myself, but I will honor the writer. This is what man adds to God. For being a puny, fragile little creature facing the monstrosity of existence, man is forced to stop on his tracks, and take notice and think about what's going on. God doesn't have that capability because it's never stopped on its tracks. It's the Almighty. Nothing forces it to stop and, oh, what is this? What's going on? And ask the big questions. But humans can, because we are puny and mortal. And as powerful as we can be in life, we are all going to die. And that's the fundamental ingredient in this recipe. It's what forces us all to ask the big questions instead of trying to find a way to live a superficial life of having fun and pleasure, an Epicurean life. What stops the attempt towards an Epicurean existence is the knowledge that we are nothing compared to the rest of nature, and we are destined to come to an end. That is the trick. That is the trick that forces the taking metacognitive notice of what's going on, and then asking the deeper questions, because it's through us that God asks the questions, and therefore comes to an answer. That's the most seminal paragraph in the whole of Jung. And I agree with him. I think this is what's going on. Yeah, it's not premeditated, but here we are. That's the game. The game is not to be rich and famous. The game is to take notice. When life breaks you, I mean, you're all adults, mature. Life has broken all of you. often I talk to younger people and life has not broken them yet. They are still in the business of being influencers and whatnot. Um, um, where I was going with this. When life breaks you, what is important is not to put the pieces together, but to take bloody notice of what's going on. When you struggle, when you're afraid, when you're depressed, take notice. Ponder about it. What is this? Why am I feeling like this? What is this feeling? What would put an end to it? Why? Why would that put an end to it? That's what it's all about. It's not about you. Another important thing that it is in Jung, but so discreet because Jung talks about individuation. So he may be perceived as saying that your life is all about you. No. And that's the greatest tragedy of the Western well-being industry today. It's all premised on this notion that your life's about you. And that's the most claustrophobic notion you can possibly have. You put on yourself, you put on your shoulders a weight that you cannot possibly carry. You're not Atlas. None of us is. And that is to be responsible for your happiness. Man, if you think that that's what your life is about, and you put that weight on your shoulders, you are in for a terrible ride, because it's just impossible to have the level of control of your existence and the world in which you're immersed to make sure that you are going to be happy. And if you think that that's the game and you are putting pressure on yourself to achieve that, God help you. Freedom comes from the realization that it's not about you, has never been, isn't, and it will never be. And if you understand that, oh, you can take a breath of fresh air, you open the windows. Okay, now we can get to the business of living, which is the business of paying attention to what's going on, not only outside, but inside. And whatever insight you get to, when you die, the end of your dissociation, those insights go right into the mind of God, because there is no dissociative boundary anymore. And Jung talks about it too, also in his autobiography, when he discusses a dream of one of his patients who dreams it 1 month before she died. And in the dream, she doesn't know yet that she's going to die, but at this point, Jung already knows that she's going to die and doesn't tell her. In the dream, she's going to an event. After she's dead, she's going to an event, and all her dead friends are in the audience of that event that's about to be held. And she's there wondering, who is coming to speak? All my dead friends are here. They are curious. They want to know something. Who is going to talk? And then she realizes she is the speaker. She's the one that has to go there and talk to her dead friends. And the message there is something that mind cannot know outside the state we call life. Something can be learned in this state that cannot be learned otherwise. The unconscious doesn't move forward without the contributions from living people who eventually die and share the goods with the tribe or with the ancestors. And that's why her dead friends are waiting for her to come and relate what her life experiences, her life's learnings. Jung talks about it as well. In the Red Book, he doesn't talk about it explicitly, but it's there if you read it. These two seminal figures, Salome and the old man, the ones that have the serpent. It comes very early in the Red Book, and they talk in a certain way. They talk about certain subjects. So they are Salome and the old man. Years later, and then eventually these figures disappear from Jung's visionary experiences, only to return years later. And to Jung's astonishment, when they return, they are exactly the same. They didn't change, they didn't mature, they didn't learn, they didn't progress. And that's why Jung says, without us contributing, the unconscious doesn't move forward. It doesn't grow, it doesn't learn. It needs us. It needs the input from this state of mind called life. And that's what imbues life with meaning. without us, God doesn't go forward. That's the idea.
Thank you.
Great
You're welcome.
question. Great answer. Okay, a lot of medicine in that for people in the psychedelic space. Some of your words there of take notice, experience, and just the purpose of being here to feed back into our ancestors and the unconscious mind. I think that's really brilliantly put. Thank you. Before we move on to another question, Patrick, you want to have a quick one?
Yeah, Bernardo, I just want to go back to your example of Jung having that vision, idea, experience in Africa. You know, he's looking over the plains. You talked about metacognition and his thinking about it. I wonder if you could talk about the distinction between being conscious, whatever that word might mean, and metacognition, because, you know, Jung was looking and then all of a sudden the thought comes to him that he articulates, and then the thought goes. Who created the thought? Where does the thought come from? I would more put it that he has an experience that becomes conscious of something that is already there that leads him to the thought, or that the thought emerges out of the experience of being conscious of something that exists already a priori to him.
Yes, for Jung, the unconscious is creative. It's the fountainhead of experiential content. Unlike Freud, for whom the unconscious is sort of a garbage dump. Jung defines what he means by consciousness in several places, but particularly in two papers, which these days are published under the title On the Nature of the Psyche. I cannot recall in which volume of the collected works that is, but there is a mass market edition today that goes by that name, On the Nature of the Psyche. And it's two long essays by Jung in which he technically discusses the nature of the psyche. And he talks about what he means by consciousness there. The first time where he tries to define what he means by consciousness was in his Terry lectures in 1933. And you can buy the proceeds of those lectures, you know, the script that he read from. And there you find his first attempt to define consciousness. But to distill throughout his corpus, what he means by consciousness is experiential contents that are placed in a web of cognitive associations. In other words, mother is only conscious if mother has child, if mother feeds, if mother protects, if dad is married to mother. And all those associations around mother is nurturing. If mother arises in the context of a web of cognitive associations, that's the first criterion for consciousness, ego consciousness or consciousness. There's another one, which is subtle, but you can find it. He talks about reflection. He's talking about metacognition. There's a third criterion. I'm not going to get into that, but what Jung calls consciousness or ego is essentially internally associated metacognition, conscious metacognition. And it entails what today goes by the name of re-representation. So there's this paper by Jonathan Schooler in 2002 on the associations between consciousness and metaconsciousness, where he clearly shows that these are different things. Phenomenal consciousness is pure experience, not necessarily the knowing of the experience. To report on an experience to yourself or others, you need to have the experience. And in addition to that, you need to know that you are having the experience. In other words, you have to re-represent the original experience. You have to reflect that original experience on the mirror of higher level cognition. Only then can you report on the experience to yourself. Now, notice that Jung, in all his works, his raw data was not only his visionary experiences, but what patients reported to him. So he was fundamentally limited to reportability in his assessment of consciousness. Consciousness to Jung methodologically, it was restricted not only to phenomenal experience, but to re-represented, reportable phenomenal experience, which is a subset of phenomenal consciousness. That is what Jung called consciousness. What did Jung call then what we refer to as phenomenal consciousness, which is not necessarily metacognitive or re-represented? What does Jung call that? He calls that the psyche. Every time he uses the word psyche, he is referring to experiential stuff, experiential contents. And on the nature of the psyche, he talks about the psychoid as psychic, because he uses this metaphor of the electromagnetic spectrum to refer to the psychoid as the infrared and the spiritual as the ultraviolet. But in saying that, what he's saying is that the psychoid is of the same nature as the psychic, because it's all the same spectrum. The difference is one of degree, not of nature. So for Jung, psyche is phenomenal consciousness, and not only personal. The collective unconscious is psychic or psychoid. With Pauli, Jung is more cautious in his use of words. It's funny to see their letters. Jung suddenly becomes very constipated and uptight and careful about how he uses the words, and like he's talking to a Nobel Prize physicist, so he gets so careful. It's funny to to see that in his own writings, and like he doesn't give a damn whether he's being consistent in his use of words or not. He assumes context and uses words in different ways. But in there, he's more careful. But it's plentifully clear throughout Jung's corpus that psyche for him is phenomenal consciousness, collective as well. The unconscious is conscious. It's phenomenally conscious. It's just not metacognizant, and its contents are not necessarily linked in a web, a tight web of internally associated experiences. And the way he refers to this feature is by saying that in the collective unconscious, there are islands of experience. That's the word he uses. And that's his way to say that these experiences are not connected with one another. They are islands. And that's why the ego is different, because it's metaconscious and everything within it is connected. You can follow a chain of cognitive associations and go from mother to child to milk to nurturing to father to home to family to human beings to earth, animals, everything is associated in some semantic way. That's ego consciousness, what he calls consciousness. But the unconscious is conscious too, in a phenomenal sense, not in Jung's sense.
Exquisite.
I'm talking a lot about Jung because I expect that's what you guys expected.
Absolutely. Just for Patrick, all for you. Thank you. I'm learning so much more from you today. I think just by being in direct contact with you, I'm getting such a deeper transmission than watching you on other YouTubes. So thank you. This is very, very exquisite. We'll just do 2 more questions and then we'll start closing. But David, did you want to speak to yours? Can't hear you, David. Even though you're unmuted, I can't hear you. No.
Can you hear me now?
And yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Lani. And sorry about that. Bernardo, I just wanted to say, just deep gratitude for your work. I think that, without getting too literal, like your work has blown my mind since I've discovered it earlier this year. Now, what I wanted to ask about, I'm not coming from a particularly Jungian perspective, is within analytic idealism, a person could have a profound experience in an altered state of consciousness and interpret it in all kinds of ways. And I wonder whether from an analytical point of view or whether from experientially, is there a way of distinguishing, like, is this just a projection of my ego, or is this actually some sort of, am I in contact with mind at large? Is the plant really speaking to me? Because, there are whole cultures built around people, having direct contact with talking with plants. And so we can't dismiss this stuff out of hand. So I wonder whether you can speak to that.
I don't think there is any recipe, surefire recipe that allows you to a priori distinguish whether it's your own shit or something else beyond you. It's exquisitely difficult to do that. I may be naive about it, but I think only a whole lot of experience can at least start pointing certain directions. There are things I have experienced during a psychedelic trip that I thought, this stuff is not mine. This stuff is really not mine. This is so profoundly alien. This is not only beyond my concepts, not only beyond physics, it's beyond logic. Now, my very logic, which is an archetypal thing in our minds, my very logic is violated. This is really, utterly, completely alien. What is a pity is that that tends to be precisely the stuff that you don't integrate, that it does nothing to you. It's so alien. It doesn't stick around. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't lead to growth. It's just like, yeah, there is that. There's that. You know what I mean? And it calibrates our self-confidence because it puts our lives in perspective. You know, we think we can cast a blanket of concepts onto nature and corral nature into our own understanding. It's like we embrace nature, and nature now we understand. We got it. We understand it. We know what's going on. Now that stuff destroys this arrogance, this incredibly childish and naive notion that we figured it out, that we at least have a sufficiently large and accurate dictionary of concepts with which we can tell the story of reality. No, we can't, because there is that, you know, there is that stuff out there. So it has this one use, which is to dissolve arrogance, dissolve epistemic arrogance. But beyond that, it doesn't do much because it is so alien. Now, of all the rest that is not that alien, I think for me, a lot of that stuff is my own shit. But my own shit goes to depths that that are unimaginable, if you know what I mean. Our memory is very weak. By the time we turn 40, our lives, you know, the experiential set that constitutes the sum total of our existence from 0 to 40 up until that moment is so overwhelming. There is so much, 99% of which we don't remember. We don't remember inner states. And the ones we do remember, we hold on to, like that one memory from when you were 3 years old. And you keep on telling that everybody you know for the rest of your life, that one thing. Well, there were another 100,000 other things just like that you don't remember. If we could remember it all, I think by the time we turn 40, we are so full. We would go supernova. We would explode. The magnitude of life would be perceived for what it is. Absolutely overwhelming, bursting, full, rich beyond comprehension. But maybe for evolutionary reasons, we don't remember all that stuff. But what I mean to say is that what I refer to unfairly in a pejorative way by saying your own shit has depths and dimensions that most of us cannot even begin to imagine by the time we are 40. So it's not to put it down to say that a lot of the psychedelic experience is your own shit. Your own shit from when you were 1 year old was cosmic shit. Know what I mean? Because your dissociation was pretty weak. You were still in contact with what you were before you were born, before you were even a zygote, before you were, you know, a fertilized egg in the womb of your mother. That stuff is still fresh. You know, it was just your previous state of mind. It was just there. So your own shit from when you were 1 year old is limitless shit. it's non-human stuff. It's well beyond our conceptualizations and categories. So it's not a put down to say that a lot of the psychedelic experience is your own shit, because it's just opening, it's dissolving internal dissociative boundaries. Now, it can, I believe, also not only theoretically and conceptually, but also from experience, it can dissolve boundaries to stuff that was never you, you know, really alien stuff. But that tends to be the less useful stuff for life. It does a job once, which is to destroy your epistemic arrogance. It does that once, but then every time it happens again, it's just, oh yeah, okay, yeah, there is that stuff. There is that alien stuff there that I can't even open my mouth to talk about. I can't do anything with it. It's there, and yeah, far out. Now we get on with life.
Yeah, great, thanks. That's a really grounding answer. That really gives me some perspective to think about, that we're dissolving boundaries within our own ego structure. That makes a lot of sense to me.
You are a universe whose depth and dimensions, I'm not, you probably know, but 99% of the people out there have no idea the size of this thing that they are. It's
Yeah.
enormous. It's an enormous, unfathomable thing.
Mm. Yeah, it's an extraordinary network of associations.
And disassociations. I just wanted to speak to that as well, David, just from my integration work. I find on a practical level, you know, if someone comes to me asking, is this literal? Is this a metaphor? Is this myth? You know, just sitting with all those possibilities, you know, painting them, speaking to it, embodying it, you know, and not in locking your mind on one answer. Like, what if it was real? What if it was a myth? What if it was your ancestors? What if it was, you know, there's so much more potential when you don't have a conclusion, more play, creativity. Beautiful. And we'll just, Shara just logged off, but she really wanted to ask this question, so I'll just ask it for her and then we can wrap it up. So with respect to the psychedelic research, which points to subjective mystical experience as an important key to therapeutic outcomes, what are your thoughts about why that may be so? I guess the link between therapeutic outcomes and the mystical experience. But do you think it's necessary for healing if the mystical is removed or abated?
You know, mystical is a characterization that some people, it's a handy label for them. You know, I'll label this a mystical experience. But of course, the label hides what they mean by mystical, and different people may mean different things by a mystical experience. I tend to regard everything as natural. But I'm sure that many of the things I call natural, if I could hand over the experience to someone else, they would say, oh, it's mystical because it transcends the ego self. Not even materialism will say that you are your ego self. So this is not a polemical question. You know, you are not your ego self. Nobody disagrees. Nobody who thinks about this, even these stupid, silly materialists who hold untenable positions, even they acknowledge this. Even they acknowledge there is no personal self. The personal self is an illusion. So if you have an experience that shows to you that you aren't your personal self, some people would call it mystical. I would say, well, welcome to what has always been the case, will always be the case, and cannot not be the case. So you know, what is a for me? For some people, mystical. It is healing to take notice of the richness within. Dissociation can happen in many levels and in many degrees. We all dissociate when we don't remember something, or when we have cognitive dissonance, when we hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time. That's dissociation. When you dream at night, you're dissociated. You think you're your dream avatar, not the rest of your dream. You're dissociated from the rest of yourself that is doing the rest of the dream. So dissociation, not remembering, it's common currency. It's the currency of psychic existence. And because it is so common, it can become pathological. Other times, it's an effort to preserve function. Like traumas that people don't remember, they block off. It's an effort to preserve function. And on short term, it works. You can still go to work and hold your job. On the long term, you're holding something inside that's not worked out, and it can somatize. It can sink into the body. And taking notice of everything that is within, becoming more explicitly aware of the story of your life and the story of what you really are, and all the richness that is entailed by what you really are. And all those narratives of self that are false, all that stuff that you aren't. It ought to be conducive to healing in the sense that what we consider to be healthy is proper organic functioning. And by organic, I don't mean physiology. I mean organic in the sense that things that are organic are cross-linked in a dynamic way, such that they support one another in a dynamic way, in the same sense that your kidneys support your circulatory system by taking toxins out of your blood. And your heart supports your lungs in the sense of making blood circulate through your those little structures in the lung that absorb oxygen. And that oxygen feeds your brain. And an organism is an interconnected dynamic system. And mental life is just that. Healthy mental life is an interconnected dynamic system that balances itself, always balances itself out. And these dissociations that are the currency of mental life, they can grow and impede that balance. They can create boundaries that impede this proper balancing out of this interconnected organic system that mental life is. And to the extent that psychedelics dissolve boundaries, they restore that balancing out, our ability to work out stuff in a balanced, organic way. So I don't think it's surprising that if used well, psychedelics are conducive not only to mental health, but probably to organic health as well, insofar as the body is the image of parts of our minds.
Beautiful. That's a great note to finish on, even unless there's anything else you wanted to say, Bernardo.
I just saw a question by Emily's iPhone that I think you missed.
Emily, do you want to speak to that?
Hey, yes, sure. No worries. It's not very specific to psychedelics, but in one way I sort of feel it is. In some psychedelic states and working with participants who are integrating these more metacognitive places, I'm seeing so much more avenues for the metacognition to include the body, as you've mentioned so beautifully so many times today. Thank you, Bernardo. So yeah, I'd just love to hear from your perspective, if you feel this more maybe openness or curiosity, or even just an unlearning of the horrible 1950s, as we've talked about, if you feel there's different types of intelligence, some of which the metacognition is coming from the body, and what psychedelics could teach us in the long term for more neurodiverse ways of relating, maturing, and is this all part of the collective unconscious plan?
What do you mean when you talk about neurodiversity? You mean, for instance,
ADD,
being the autism spectrum? Okay.
Yeah, ADD, ASD, people who can experience, say, synesthesia without a medicine, these more embodied ways of living, integrating, but in a traditional psychology sense, we've labeled it as, well, that's not coming from the intellect, that's diverse, that's wrong.
Yeah. Well, anything that can be expressed in the mind of a human or in the body of a human is per force part of nature. It's one of the potentialities of nature. Now, there are two ways you can then start studying it. You can say, well, there is a statistical distribution. Certain modalities are statistically more prevalent and more common, and others are more rare. Okay, you can do that, but you still didn't fundamentally distinguish between them. Some are more common, others are not, but they are all expressions of the potentialities of nature, so they're still equal. It so happens that some seem to be more common given the way we evolved and given the parameters of the ecosystem in which we live. So that's not very important, I think. The other way you can go about it is you can label some of these modalities as pathological or not. The danger of doing this, though, is that what is considered pathological is always culture bound. For South American Indians, South American natives, schizophrenia is a badge of honor. You become the shaman. You're the guy who can, or the woman who can talk to the gods. And you can bring messages back to the tribe. Suddenly, you're the most important member of the tribe. You are the most functional. You have a capacity that nobody else has. You can talk to the ancestors. For us, it's dysfunctional because you can't type your email, or you can't manage your people, can't drive your car. Pathological or not pathological is a culture-bound label. It changes across geographies and changes across time and across histories. And that's something we have to be very cognizant of. There is still some use to the label, because I can guarantee you that people with schizophrenia today have a very hard life, and they would feel tremendously offended if you were to just tell them, just get on with your life, it's all normal, because they would feel that we would be underestimating how hard it is for them to exist in this society in the 21st century with that modality being expressed through them. So this is real. People will suffer because of the expression of certain modalities that are perfectly natural, given the circumstances of the society in which they live in. So what is artificial is probably the culture, but it's the clash between the modality and the culture in which it finds itself expressing itself that can lead to suffering and dysfunction. So I think there is some use to the word pathology, even though I think it is fundamentally unnatural, because everything that expresses itself in nature is natural. So is schizophrenia, ADHD, whatever, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, which I have. It's hardly anymore, but I have had anxiety disorder, depression. In other cultures, well, let me make up. I'll make up a culture now. I imagine a culture in which depression is extraordinarily useful and functional, because by being depressed, you are forced to confront the big questions of life. You cannot be a philosopher without being depressed. Nietzsche was depressed throughout his life. Søren Kierkegaard was depressed throughout his life. I mean, the list goes on, and find a famous, truly productive, insightful philosopher that wasn't depressed. Schopenhauer was depression incarnated. The man was walking depression. In a society of philosophers, depression would be functional. You'd be selected to go to the academia because of your depression. You are the guy who is asking all the right questions. You're the guy who sees beyond the Epicurean life everybody's surfing through. So I am of two minds. I think at a deep level, the entire spectrum is normal. Pathologizing something we do. At a more superficial level, we have to honor the pathologizing, otherwise we would be guilty of not recognizing people's suffering. The same goes for race. Humans don't have race. It's completely nonsensical to speak of race. to humans. You know, you would say, oh, you're white, Bernardo. I look a lot more like a tall East African with elongated traces than I look like Danny DeVito. What do you mean Danny DeVito and I are Caucasian and the East African is something else? I mean, humans don't have race. Dogs have. Any two pugs will look more like one another than any pug will look like a German Shepherd. But you cannot say that for humans. You cannot say that any two black people will look more like one another than any one black people will look like a white person. Come on, an East African looks pretty much like I do. And they have something I don't have, which is a natural sunscreen and the propensity to not put on weight. And I wish I had both. But other than these superficial characteristics, humans have no race, but we cannot get rid of the concept of race, because otherwise there would be no racism. And then we would not be able to consider that unethical and criminal. So for the exact same reason, I think pathologizing, it's a wrong thing that we have to pretend is true, because otherwise we wouldn't be recognizing the suffering of people who need help. But other than that, all modalities are equally a potential of the mind of nature, and different human beings express these different modalities to different degrees, and they are not discrete either. It's insane to think that a person can only express either the male modality or the female modality. What do you mean? Nature is not binary. Nature is continuous. We all express an analog, continuous mix of modalities, and it has always been like this. It's just cultural convention that tries to argue it in some other way. Jung tried to restore balance, at least when it comes to gender modality. And the idea of individuation is the idea of bringing both gender modality, or both poles, because there is a spectrum in between, like between infrared and ultraviolet. There is everything and anything in between. Jung tried to bring the entire spectrum to a human mind before the end of life. That's the idea of individuation. But we are making slow progress. Indian culture centuries ago was not binary. All modalities just played in, and nobody, I mean, I remember as a kid, I liked Country Club. I don't know whether you guys remember Country Club, a rock band, and the singer was Boy George, who was sort of androgynous male-female character. I remember as a kid hearing my father talk to my mother, having a discussion about whether Boy George was a man or a woman, or whether he wanted to be a woman or was a woman who wanted to be a man. And I remember, I must have been 7 or 8 years old. I remember listening to that discussion. I was on the rug of my living room when my parents were talking on the sofa behind me, and there was a clip of Country Club, a video clip playing on the TV in front of me. And I was picking up their conversation, and I remember my thinking, what a silly conversation. It's completely useless. Who cares about it's Boy George. It's just Boy George. Why all the discussion? What Boy George is this, that, and I think that is the natural approach to the question. Each person is a person. That's the sum total of it. Each recipe has a different degree and combination of spices, and all spices are part of nature. I mean, it's pretty obvious what I said, right? It's embarrassing that we live in a society in which the question needs to be asked and someone needs to answer, just to put it on the record. But yeah,
that's
great. The 21st century.
Thanks, Emily. Good to see you. Yeah, I love how you use the word modality, just the different modalities that people can plug into different, mental health or states of consciousness. And as practitioners, many of us on this channel are practitioners, the modalities that we can support people for that modality to then, have to thrive and to adapt to the culture, the forced culture that we're in. So yeah, I really love how you've used the word modality there. Thank you. Well, in your words, I'd have to say you're, you know, a brilliant altar in the conscious universe, and quite an upgrade the ancestors will get one day when your knowledge dissolves into the unconscious. So thank you for.
I'm
you know,
approaching that day every day, steady speed.
yeah, but it's what a beautiful, you know, I often, you know, often contemplate death. Some days peacefully, some days not so peacefully, and just that metaphor, just a very visual of that dissolving back into and what potentially goes back into that space. So
go back to the ancestors, and there are many of them that I'm looking forward to to engaging with again.
beautiful.
Anyway.
And thank you for your time, you know, 2 hours out of your
Thank you all.
time. And the Australian community will access this, and it will go far and wide. And yeah, thank
Thanks
you
all of you. I'm going to bed now. It's 3 a.m. here, so I need to
incredible.
go horizontal.